Many would argue that procurement has entered a new era. In many ways, you can look at the days of, where we only focused on cost savings, and it's turning. It's changing, and today there's many more expectations that companies have. Not only cost, but the other areas and other dimensions of value, whether that be in risk, whether it be in sustainability, resilience, et cetera. And how do we balance all of that to create competitiveness? So today at DPW, I'm joined by Vel, CEO of Beroe, as well as Vijay, a partner at Kearney, and we're going to explore how leading companies and procurement teams are reinventing their operating models. In some ways, how are they moving from less of a calendarized look at their operating models and plans to one that's more continuous, in a way to create this more continuous competitiveness as a supply management procurement organization. So let's start with what's driving this shift. I just mentioned that we see this and going to less project and much more continuous competitiveness, moving away from only a focus on cost. What's driving that? And the other thing I wanted you to comment on is not what's only driving it, but when did it begin? Vel, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on here. I've run Beroe for 19 years, and I've seen procurement move pretty tremendously from what was, as you mentioned, a very calendar-driven, project-driven culture to a competitiveness and always on, always optimize kind of a model. And I think a few things are driving it, and I was just speaking with Vijay just before this, and he was talking about how the velocity of change in the market has accelerated.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that stands out as I speak with CPOs is that the planning horizons are starting to shrink, and where you could fairly safely build a 5-year, 3-year plan, and know where you were going to deploy your resources, you pretty much would have a sense for what 5 years out, how your operations or your company might look like.
Yeah.
I think that's changing pretty dramatically. And I think in an ideal world, given the amount of volatility, the planning horizons should start being days and weeks, and the ability to have that agility to adapt to all of the external changes, whether in the supply base, business requirements, competitors. I think procurement's a key part of that, because ultimately, 40-50% of cost is driven by procurement. So flexibility of procurement, I think, drives the flexibility of the entire organization. Yeah. So I'm seeing that as a major shift, and that's driving a lot of what you talked about.
Yeah. Vijay, what are your thoughts?
No, I think I couldn't agree more with what Vail said. See, for me, there are just two things I want to bring, right? One is, when you just look at external market, things are changing rapidly, much more than ever before. And on the other hand, the technology cycles. I mean, these two are good examples, right? When you just look at external market, I mean, if you're a big fashion house, product development used to take 350 days from design to development. Mm-hmm. And this was the traditional retailers. And it takes 3 to 5 days. I repeat, 3 to 5 days in fast fashion with Shein.
Yeah.
And that's 10 times faster than Zara. So if this is how the external market, I mean, depending on where you're in your value chain, is changing, you will not only sense the signal, you need to start acting based on the signal.
Yeah.
I mean, the other beautiful example that is just mind-boggling, I was just telling Vail, if you look at even the technology cycles, with OpenAI, it took 18 months to move from a ChatGPT or GPT 3.0 to 3.5.
Right.
And it takes 3 months to move from GPT, 4.5 to 5.0.
Yeah.
So it's just
shrinking very rapidly. And it's interesting because you think about competitiveness, I would argue that, one of the key dimensions of being competitive is speed. Is what you're just saying. I mean, I mentioned a number of different things, and, if you think about procurement, how do we do that? But, one is just the cadence of the business is fundamentally changing, and so what we do in supply management has to keep up with that and enable that speed that is, like you said, at 10x in fast-moving fashion compared to where we are today. So let me ask you this. If this is where it's at, I know not everybody has the ability to move and is moving in this direction. And so what do you think is holding organizations back from, jumping on and really riding the shift or getting ahead of the shift that you both described?
I mean, this is very classic for me. If you just look at most procurement organizations, I would even argue all, these were designed with an operating model, with the principles of operating model goes back to the ERP days. And a bit of, process optimization, how to ensure the ERPs work smooth. There hasn't been a big shift in the last 25 years that I've seen, maybe a little bit of outsourcing here and there. That's about the only shift you've seen.
Yeah.
So many companies, unless they're like a proprietor-owned, like four-person team, are able to sense the signals, and very few are able to act upon the signals.
Yeah.
And this fundamental rethink of operating model to ensure, right, you're constantly monitoring the signals, but then you're measured on outcomes needs to be the focus as opposed to measured on the process.
Yeah. And you mentioned, being able to act on them, but it's, part of it is, I'm go back to what I said about speed. It's the speed by which you act.
Correct.
Because it's sort of like you get a signal, and you could almost say that signal gets stale over time if you don't act on it quickly. So that's going to drive some of that competitiveness.
Absolutely. I mean, the best example that I have, when Trump released a fury messages on Trump Social or X, it had Apple had the Foxconn that manufactures in India, when tariffs were announced, had 2 weeks to respond to a 25% tariffs.
Right.
And they were able to move 2 million iPhones from India to US.
Yeah.
And the acting window was 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And the cost competitiveness, or however you want to call, basically, right, it was a 25% tariffs.
Yeah.
So the 25% on the top line would be impacted if you don't act in this quick time.
Right.
So as demand signals are having the frequency and even the number of signals are changing so dramatically, then if you don't act, you lose the competitiveness.
Yeah.
And that's why it becomes very important in today's age.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll add a little bit to that. And of course, the element of speed and the ability to read all of those signals is key. But I think there's a more fundamental challenge as well.
Yeah.
And I would put a lot of the blame, if you will, on metrics. And if the procurement organization is measured on savings relative to budget or relative to last year's baseline,
Right.
it creates a culture of inward-looking focus.
Yes.
Right? And the procurement organization's metric for what good looks like is itself from 12 months ago.
Yeah.
And if you look at most other parts of the organization, the measurement is outward focused. A sales organization is always measuring their performance relative to themselves, but also relative to the competition by measuring market share. And I think one key shift that's truly going to unleash the full power of procurement and orient the entire organization towards the appropriate goals is creating that externally focused mindset where a procurement organization is measured on competitiveness, on cost, on speed, on risk, innovation, etc., against their competitive base, because that's what the leadership teams of these companies want to hear about. Is, do we have a better cost structure than our 3 key competitors? Do we have a speedier supply chain? Do we have a more resilient supply chain? And I don't think too many procurement organizations have made that shift. So people can stay content with discrete calendar-based optimization because that gets them to their immediate goals.
Yeah.
So once that starts shifting, and I think it is starting to shift, AI is certainly an enabler to provide that exoskeleton to these procurement teams to dramatically enhance their capacity to act. So the threshold of intervention is dropping. So as procurement organizations traditionally may have said, we're not going to intervene unless there's an opportunity of a certain size. I think that's going to keep dropping. And over a period of time, the shift to always-on optimization, as we discussed earlier, will be a reality. But I think there has to be vision and commitment from the procurement leadership to drive that change.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think we're starting to see the glimmer of that change. And I'll tell you why. You're familiar with the study that we do in terms of the priorities of procurement organizations. And one of the things that we saw in June when we published an interim update was that the focus on competitive differentiation, an advantage within the procurement organization as a priority has elevated into a top 10. And we've never seen that before. And it's something like you guys are talking about it. You see the necessity to do that. But I think we're starting to see the recognition. That doesn't mean doing it, but the recognition that we have to do it. So let me pivot a little bit. And, as we talk about this idea of cost competitiveness, how does that look like in practice? We got a lot of people listening in here, and we say, all right, I get it. I understand why we're doing this, how we're going to do this shift, et cetera. But what does it look like? If I'm sitting there and driving that, what does that look like?
You to go first?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
So I was actually having lunch with somebody, and I was explaining exactly this concept to them and talking about competitiveness, and they asked me to give them a more tangible example. And what I was sharing with them is, imagine if you as an individual were rewarded based on the number of kilos or the amount of weight you lost in any given year, right? You're almost incentivized in those cases to put on a lot of weight so you can drop it because the size of your reward is based on that. There's no reward for
differential, yeah.
And there's no reward for staying fit every day, right? Because if you are fit and you stay at the same weight every day, you have no weight loss, and therefore your reward is limited.
Yeah.
And I think that's the shift that I'm starting to see is procurement organizations that are focused on competitiveness will not talk about savings because there is nothing left to save. They just beat the market, they beat the competition every day, and they measure themselves accordingly, and they orient their operating model, their contracts, their supply relationships in a way that incentivizes that sort of competitiveness as against once in 3 year kind of savings activities. That I think is how I would see the shift. And historically, when there was a certain amount of cycle time and a certain amount of bandwidth required for a sourcing initiative, you could only source something once a year, once in 3 years, etc. With this AI exoskeleton, I think the ability to respond and intervene is going to be dramatically enhanced. And I think that's going to move us more and more close to intervening at any point of time, no matter how small the size of the price is, and you then shift to being rewarded for being competitive every day. And so that's how I visualize it.
Let me ask you before, Vijay, I get a perspective from you, and you both have been highlighting the idea to respond. What about being predictive and getting ahead? Obviously, people use the definition of agile, and you can be agile and say, well, what is agility? And it's you could say it's the ability to react quickly to something, being flexible, etc. But there's also this perspective of getting ahead of it, being more predictive. How does that fit into this, from a cost competitiveness standpoint? Maybe Vijay, you got a perspective on that.
Absolutely. See, let me just take a step back, right? So we worked on a large engagement recently, one of the largest oil and gas engagement. We mapped every single activity that procurement does.
Yeah.
And the actions the procurement organization need to take. And it actually came up to a number that we quantified. It happens to be around 920 for this company. Plus or minus 10%, I'm sure it varies depending on the size and complexity. And then what we did was, out of these 920 actions a month a procurement needs to take, what portion of it are true decisions that's going to change the outcome. That typically means there is a little bit of a, some judgment that needs to be applied. And what portions of these actions are execution based, which is more like hit the button, just say approve. The person who is saying approve has no more intelligence to do than an AI bot. Or, it's just a process. It's more the ERP days of, ensuring, right, we cover up every single action so that we follow the process. So the ability to now have AI take care of all of this execution action and leaving along those 20% of the decisions where there is judgment that is involved becomes the most biggest unlock that the procurement organizations can do. And having the governance, having the intelligence for people to act on these 20% of the decisions is the biggest unlock that we would see to enable this continuous competitiveness. Along with the biggest thing that Vail said, the metrics, right? It's not the metrics that matter anymore, it's about the actions that matter.
About the actions and whether you're actually creating the advantage, the differentiation, the competitiveness. Yeah.
And in response to your question, Chris, you were talking about the ability to predict, and you were juxtaposing it with agility. And I think for a long period of time, supply chain and procurement organizations have been chasing this mythical ability to predict at a higher level of accuracy, and I don't think that's really happened. And I think the key thing is to recognize that you are never going to be able to forecast at the level of quality and accuracy that you need, and therefore agility is your only option. So to the extent that you have a supply base and contract structure that is responsive and is able to adapt to any kind of situation, whether predicted, unpredicted, that I think is a smarter way to think of it. You can improve forecast accuracy a bit, but then I think the paradox is that the more sophisticated your prediction models are, the more complex the world's getting. So I think overall it all is a wash, right? And I think overall the extent of forward visibility that we have now versus 20 years ago, I don't think is dramatically different.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. You're talking about the predictive model, and I think it is. I mean, it's even predicting weather. I think we've gotten better, but there's so many variables that it becomes difficult. And certainly AI is going to play a role in this, and the AI agents. And Vijay, you mentioned a little bit about that, but tell me how you see specifically around agentic AI and that environment that we're building. How do you see that enabling or augmenting, an organization to be able to create that competitive, because there's a criticality being different. And I want you to, if you can talk about how will you differentiate? If everybody has access to agents, and and again, you could argue, what becomes a differentiator? What really over time creates that differentiation, that competitiveness?
Yeah, I mean, Chris, this is so true, right? Like just walking around the halls of TPW, it's amazing to see so much innovation. But you can also see there's a lot of what I call as commonality in how people are. I mean, every company, every innovation is approaching. There is a bit of that confluence that's just arriving, depending on different providers. So, for me, it's not the access to agents. Access to agents becomes a commodity, right? Again, combining market intelligence and internal intelligence, but it's the ability to act on it is what that matters. And having a very clear script, right, of, like I said, among the 920 actions that needs to be taken, what are the true actions that can be taken in a timely manner, and ensuring that you're taking that, of course, in an agile, timely manner, but also ensuring you're not leaving anything on the table, right?
Right.
To have the right decision metrics becomes the most important.
Yeah.
But for me, that becomes the core. It's the actions that matter is how companies are able to differentiate in the future.
Okay.
I would I would add to that and say that in our experience, if you think about it, I think there's three levels that interplay here. So there's the data layer, there's the interpretation layer, and then there's the action layer. And Vijay just talked about how the ability to act, the ability to take those signals and have the rapid response to them, I think is key.
Right.
But I would equally emphasize data.
Yeah.
And that's what's becoming very, very clear when companies implement agents, etc. Is the agent is only as good as the data it has access to.
Right.
And a lot of companies are building their agents on top of publicly available data. There's going to be no competitive advantage there because your competitors are going to have exactly the same information, and even worse, your suppliers are too, right? And one of the things that we're hearing more and more is that suppliers or sales teams are investing in AI agents at a faster pace and are a few months ahead of where procurement's investments are. So if you're going into a negotiation supported by a bot that's only sitting on top of public data, but your negotiation counterparty is sitting on a much richer ecosystem of information, you're never going to win. And so I think the data piece is something that most AI agentic companies don't seem to have taken into account. And I would argue that even if there's the differential may not be as high as it used to be, right? But if you look at the financial industry or the financial equity markets, etc., 1 trillionth of a second of difference in terms of a signal getting to them makes a big difference, right? Which is why companies pay for having direct fiber optic lines from the exchanges to their offices. So I think that's what's going to happen, is that people will look for that 1% extra insight, which will drive much better decisions.
Well, it's really interesting because you guys have talked about, I mean, certainly some of these areas, becoming more non-differentiating, whether it be cost, et cetera. And it's all about competitiveness. And then the question becomes, and what we've explored is, how do we create that? We've talked about speed, absolutely. We've talked about, just, being able to act on that, whatever it is. And also the information and data, that intelligence that you have as well will be differentiating. Potentially the agents are more or less workers that are more commoditized in our environments. We got like 1 minute left, and I do want to ask you both a question. We're sitting here 3-5 years from now. What does procurement competitiveness look like? And how are we talking about that?
Vijay, I'll let you go first.
See, for me, every day you wake up, you're ensuring your procurement is not rewarded, right, on doing something different, but it's ensuring that they're not any balls drop. That the actions or default needs to be taken based on the signals, and not taking an action is what gets measured, and it's not about, not taking an action for me is more important than taking an action in the future. That ensures this continuous competitiveness is being measured.
Okay. Bill?
Yeah, I think I would echo what Vijay said, and I think the procurement organization of the future should be able to make a very simple statement to the rest of the business. We have created a supply base that is more responsive than the competition, more agile, more cost competitive, more innovative, etc., and be able to very tangibly show what that gap is from the competition and how that gap is improving, and should be comfortable with a goalpost that is almost invisible. I think that's the biggest challenge that I see, is procurement has a goalpost that's set very clearly at the beginning of the year, and then everybody runs towards that very discretely defined goal. But if you can't see the goalpost, because you've got to beat the market by a certain percentage, or you've got to beat your competition by a certain percentage, and you can't really see where they are, I think that'll pull out the best in every procurement organization. So I see that as the future procurement organization. And I think a lot of the challenges we see in terms of having a seat at the table, getting the right kind of engagement, etc., a lot of those will drop off, because then what procurement is measured on is very clearly linked to top and bottom line, and that business orientation will come automatically.
Yeah. Well, thank you, both of us. And I know we could sit here and continue to talk about this. This is a great topic in terms of, really just changing the mindset of procurement individuals, how we think about this capability within our organizations, and certainly a new perspective in terms of the competitiveness that we're actually driving. So thank you, Vel. Thank you, Vijay.
Thanks, Chris.